Is that it? Good evening. Man, it's good to be in the house of the Lord tonight. We're going to look at the Word of God, sort of. I sometimes feel like I'm preparing a Western Civ lesson. But we're going to look tonight at kind of the tail end of what I had prepared from last week. And then we're going to move into, in this history of Israel, kind of a history of Israel. I don't have a lot of, I've been trying to show you some people groups that we might think are ancestors of the Arab people. You know, really, now I'm going to get political. There really isn't a people group called Palestinians. Palestine is actually a form of Philistine. So the Romans, when they conquered this land, we're going to see that, named this Palestina. And that's the Latin pronunciation of a Hebrew term, or whatever language they spoke. But in the Hebrew Bible, it is Philistines. And so this was Palestina, but the Jews went by Jews. They were Jews. So the leftovers, I shouldn't say it that way, but the leftovers just kind of became known as Palestinians. There's never really been a country named Palestine, never really been a people group named Palestinians. So anyway, we'll get to that. Okay, next slide. It's all about the land. That's what we're doing tonight. We're looking at, through this study, about the land, the people groups that occupied this land, Ham and Shem and their descendants, quite the majority. The Japhethites were more European, more northern areas. But God promised the land to Abraham. And ultimately, whatever we discover historically, God promised Israel this land, and they will have it. So, and please understand, it's not going to take an Israeli army. It's not going to take an act of the United States. It's not going to take the UN, the United Nations. Jesus is going to make sure they have that land. When He comes and rules for 1,000 years, that's going to be the land of Israel. If I understand Scripture correctly, that will happen. Now, in between that time, from now till then, what should we think about all that? It's not as easy as A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3, and we'll get to that eventually. But we're still building through history, the chronological history of this land. So let's jump back in and show me the next slide. So just to kind of pick up there. So we have the united monarchy of Israel being Saul, David, Solomon for approximately 120 years. There was a united kingdom of Israel. David is the best known king. You can go and you can read through. In fact, I've been reading through the 2 Kings and actually 1 and 2 Kings and part of 2 Chronicles, and noted again that these Manasseh and Amon and all these different kings were always compared to David. David was sort of the epitome king of Israel. After Solomon reigned for 40 years, Rehoboam, his son, came on the scene, and there was already, we can even actually see the fracture of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom all the way back to the days of the judges. Even before King David, we started seeing Ephraim and the northern kingdom sort of separating from Judah and the southern kingdom. Well, this came to a head when Jeroboam actually was the servant of King Solomon, and he rebelled against Solomon. And then Rehoboam, I think, made a really foolish decision of saying, you think my daddy's been hard on you, I'm going to make it harder on you. And we have a split. Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah. Next slide. And in 722 BC, the Assyrians, here's the Assyrian kingdom, came and conquered the north. Now, if you squint your eyes, and you can actually, got my pointer with me. You can, not that, that. You can see where it talks here about the conquering of this area of Judah, and that did happen. When this was all finished, about the only thing that was remained of Judah was Jerusalem and the vicinities. King Hezekiah was the one that for a short period of time they were able to keep the city of Judah. This is the southern kingdom, Judah. But all of this, Israel, was taken by the Assyrians. Next slide. Then we have the Babylonians. And they came 30 years later. And they defeated the Assyrians. And then in 586, they took it all. So Babylon, and this is the history that Jeremiah tells us about. Jeremiah lived to see this, and the 70 years, we'll get into that in just a moment. The 586, from 586 to 606, I didn't say that right. 586 to 516, and there's a couple of ways that you can look at that. But 70 years of captivity. And Israel, in essence, was sort of, we might say, unified under Babylonian captivity. But please understand, there was never a nation of Israel. After the Babylonian captivity, there really never was a nation of Israel after that, up till 1948. So that's a long time, right? So next slide. Then the Persians came, and I say, think Daniel. Okay, so think Daniel. Go to Daniel's life, and at first Daniel was serving under Nebuchadnezzar. You remember that guy? That's Babylonia. And then all of a sudden, he's serving under Darius. Y'all remember that? No, y'all haven't read Daniel in a while. So all of a sudden we go from Nebuchadnezzar, the interpretation of the dreams and all that stuff, and then all of a sudden now we have this Darius figure. Now who's Darius? He's the king of Persia. So the Persians came in and defeated the Babylonians. Actually, Keaton and I was talking the other night, and he sent me off on a rabbit trail, and I learned something. That when we talk about Arab people, there are Arab people, but we also need to talk about the Persians. Because, I didn't know this, that Iran, for example, is half Persian, half Arab. Okay, that's just a ballpark figure, okay? And as I further read, that's kind of a big deal. I didn't really realize it was kind of a big deal. That I did know, having traveled in Greece, so here's Greece, here's Turkey, this is Greece, this is Turkey, that's all that divides them. And for lack of better terminology, they hate one another. But you do not call Turks Arabs. They're Persians. And that's kind of a big deal to them. So anyway, that's what all this comes from. This is where that comes from. And then we're going to talk tonight about how the Persians and the Greeks fought one another You know, there's wars and rumors of wars at all times. So the Greeks and the Persians fought one another, made some great movies about that. But we'll talk about that tonight. So the end result is Israel is under the Persians. End result. And that's how the Old Testament ends. Okay? How does the Old Testament end? Israel occupied, controlled by the Persians. That's how the Old Testament ends. Next slide. So we'll look at some of this. So 70 years of captivity, and you can look at Jeremiah 29:10, but let's read 2 Chronicles 36. And sometimes we don't get this about the Old Testament, but when we get to 2 Chronicles 36, which is the last chapter of Chronicles, we're at the end of the Old Testament. You say, no, we're not. No, we got Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and Job and Psalms and Proverbs. And this is the end of the history. This is the end of the history of, now there's more, but we're getting to the end. There is Ezra and Nehemiah. We got to add that. But we're getting to the end. So let's read 20 through 23. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. So what did he just say? They were carried off to Babylon, and they were his servants until the Persians came. Okay? Persia defeats Babylon. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Jeremiah who? Jeremiah the bullfrog? Jeremiah the prophet, who had said prior to the defeat, the destruction of Jerusalem and the city, or the temple, the Solomon's temple, he said 70 years. Jeremiah 29:10. 70 years. And so you can read that in Jeremiah 29:10. But it says, until the land has enjoyed her desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now what God said, the reason for the 70 years was all the many Sabbaths, and it's actually the seventh, the Sabbath year that Israel did not observe the Sabbath year. And so God said, the land will have her Sabbaths. For 70 years it will lay desolate. So I guess that's, thank you. I can't do math. Yeah, I know, I can't do math. So, 77s. And then it says, now we're going to move forward. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now what are we talking about? So look on my little slide here. 539 BC. Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. By the way, Isaiah, before Cyrus was born, named Cyrus. And that puts all the biblical critics in a tailspin. They just say, well, obviously that was not written during Isaiah's day. Isaiah wrote in the 700 BCs. So 200 years prior to Cyrus living, Isaiah said Cyrus, king of Persia. He made a prophecy about this. And so all the biblical critics say, that couldn't have been written in Isaiah's day. Well, why couldn't it have been? I mean, God said in Micah chapter 5 that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. And that's 1,000 years before. 1,000 years before Jesus was born. It's hard for me to do numbers in my head. I think words, not numbers. All right, so Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, here's the decree, 536, so 539, Cyrus, the king of Persia, defeats Babylon. 536, BC dates go backwards. That always confuses me. So 536 is actually closer to us than 539 is. And so he makes a decree, and we'll go over and read it in Ezra. Thus saith, this is his decree, thus saith King Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me. Did you hear what he just said? He just called on the name of the Lord. Maybe Daniel had something to do with that. And he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem. I have no record of this, but I wonder if a prophet of God went and told him that, which is in Judah. So he's commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah, who is among you of all his people, and may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. Let's just start in Ezra chapter 1. Now the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus saith King Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me. How do you know that? And he has commanded me. Who commanded me? How did he communicate that to him? To build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judea, just like we just read, right? So, and then he just goes on and said, go to Jerusalem and build that place. Verse 4, and whoever is left in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold and with goods and livestock, besides the freewill offerings for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So this Persian king, Cyrus, historically, not biblically, yes, but also historically well known. This is well known. Cyrus gave not just the Jews, but we're focusing on the Jews, but all peoples could return to their land and rebuild whatever had been destroyed. And so this is what starts the history of Ezra and Nehemiah. Next slide. And so we have the rebuilding of the temple. So the completion, so we're in Ezra, right? So let's just go over to chapter 6 and just see that it happened. So verse 15 says, now the temple was finished. So they started the temple back in, what was it, chapter 3, I think. They started the temple in chapter 3. Foundation was laid under Zerubbabel, and then it was finished, and it took them, I forget how many years, but 30 years crosses my mind. But in verse 15, the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Now, we have to really do some homework on some of that, of which Darius we're talking about. Darius was more of a title than it was a first name, and that gets kind of confusing sometimes. But we know that from the time of the decree of Cyrus to the rebuilding of the temple was 20 years. And so then, okay, I'll leave that alone. Back up one for me. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Up at the very top, where did we get 70 years? The 586, when Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed, to the 516, the rebuilding of the temple, 70 years. Whew, my math makes me nervous. Or some date it from 606, so that's 20 years prior, which was the time when the first Israelites was deported to Babylon. We think Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were some of those guys. And then 536 is when the decree was made. So whichever of those you want to pick, I kind of go by the 586 to 516. I think that one, I don't know, seems to make more sense to me. But if you like the other one, that's fine too. All right, now go back to the next slide. So the temple was rebuilt. Now, just to give you some biblical stuff, you got to hold your place at Ezra and skip all the way over to the end of the Old Testament. Y'all have no idea how to find Haggai, do you? And if you sing the song, you're going to have to sing through about 30-something books before you get to Haggai. So I'll just help you out and just find Malachi and go backwards. That's the easy way to find Haggai. So it's Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So it's the third to the end. And it's a really little book and it's hard to find. But what I want to show you in this is how that the people, when they saw the rebuilt temple, we just went through this at the end of our David study in Sunday school. Did y'all see the amount of gold and silver and precious metals that was donated for the temple? That's mind-boggling. Tons of that stuff. I mean, we were trying to figure it out. Ryan was doing the math on his phone, and we come up to billions of dollars. We don't know how much it costs today, but I can't imagine the glory of that Temple of Solomon that was destroyed by the Babylonians. Now, they rebuilt the temple. And he says in verse 3 of Haggai 2, he said, "Who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory?" Anybody, any of y'all remember Solomon's temple? That's what he said. All you old dudes out there, y'all remember Solomon's temple? Oh yes, I remember. I was a young kid, but I remember going for the Passover and seeing that glorious building. Now, this building, how do you see it? In comparison with it, is it not in your eyes as nothing? So people were already complaining about the new building. And they were saying, it ain't what it used to be. Wasn't like the temple of old. And so he goes through there and he says, "Be strong. Y'all don't give up. You know, this is going to be good." And he says in verse 6, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, once more, it is a little while, and I'm going to shake heaven and earth and sea and dry land. And I will shake all nations, and they shall come to the desire of all nations." That's in our Christmas songs. Desire of all nations. Who's that? Who's the desire of all nations? "And I will fill this temple with glory, saith the Lord. The silver is mine and the gold is mine, saith the Lord. The glory of this latter temple shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, saith the Lord of hosts." How is the latter temple going to be more glorious than the former temple when everybody looks at it and says it don't have near as much gold in it, doesn't have near as much silver in it? Well, what Haggai is telling us is that Jesus is going to walk in that temple. And Jesus is more glorious than any kind of gold or silver. So it is God's will, obviously, that this temple was rebuilt. And then we can hop, skip, and jump a little bit. Nehemiah's story is about rebuilding the walls primarily. But what else is going on is they're actually rebuilding that city. And some of them get in trouble because they went and built their own house first. You remember that? How that everybody went to build their own house and they neglected God's work. That'll preach, but I won't preach that tonight. But some of us tend to want to put our wants and wishes in front of God's work, but I'll just leave that alone tonight. But what's amazing to me, Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15, it took all of 52 days. I want to hire their general contractors. Took 52 days. Now, not all the wall was laying on the ground. Let's just be clear. There were like big holes in the walls. But to rebuild it in 52 days, and this is where we get the sword in the trowel. Y'all remember, y'all know the old adage, the sword in the trowel. What is that talking about? They held a sword in one hand and a trowel in another hand because they was always ready to have to fight off the enemies. So even in their going back to the land, the neighbors didn't want them there. And I hope you're seeing a pattern here, because this has never not been. In other words, to say this has always been. Israel has always struggled to live in the land. What we hear on the news today is not news, in the sense it's not new. It's not new. It's been going on for thousands of years. They had to fight to get there in the first place. And just by the way, just so we're all on the same page, God kicked them out of that land a whole lot more often than anybody else has. Just so you know. Now, God also wants them to have that land, but God also told them, look, when you disobey me, I'm going to kick you out of that land. And he did so in the 70 years of captivity. So, the Old Testament ends with only really, there's only one little spot that Israel has much, and I don't even want to know if control is the right way, occupation. And that's Jerusalem and the very close surrounding areas. My math may not be good, but I came up with, looking through Ezra and Nehemiah, and there's a lot of list of people, but only approximately less than 100,000 Jews returned. And I read that in the mid-1850s, now I'm talking AD dates now, 1850s, total Palestinian land. There was no Israel in 1850, right? Okay, there is no Israel in the sense of a nation. But in that Palestinian area, there was only about 160,000 Jews. About 160,000. There were more Jews in Brooklyn, New York than there were in Israel. There's still a bunch of Jews in Brooklyn, New York. But, all right, next slide. Okay, so this gives you a timeline. Helps you kind of visualize. So let's just say that 70 years captivity, they number some things differently, and that's okay. But that 70 years, 536, they say 537. I'm not going to argue that too much. Zerubbabel, this is the return and the rebuilding of the temple. 537, 36 to 516. I like round numbers, 20 years. Ezra returns, 458. I think that's a little bit late, but I won't argue that. And then we have 445, Nehemiah, rebuilding of the walls, 432, Malachi. So let's just use round numbers, 400. So let's just say 400 BC, the Old Testament is finished. Next slide. And Amos tells us, Amos chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. I'll read that real quick. And Amos is hidden in these small little prophet books either. Amos, yeah. Amos chapter 8 and verse 11 and 12. Behold, the days are coming, saith the Lord, that I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst of water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. And they shall wander, and this is talking about Israel, and they shall wander from sea to sea, and from north to east. I don't know how and they shall, I'm guessing they do north, east. I don't know. Anyway, from there, back up. And they shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but shall not find it. And this I think, speaks of the scattering of the nation of Israel during the intertestament period. So you see, intertestamental period. This is between Malachi and Matthew, about 400 years. And there will not be a word of the Lord, as in a revelation, as in a prophet. I think it is the angels coming to Zechariah to tell of the birth of John the Baptist that broke this 400 years of silence. And then it's not too much longer that the angel appears to Mary, and Jesus is to be born. So there's 400 years. What happened? This country isn't 400 years old. Got to put that in perspective. This country, the United States, go back 400 years. We don't exist as a country. So what happens in this 400 years? We're going to look at it. So Persia is in control when we leave the Old Testament. And you know what? Israel had it pretty good. Under Persian control, you know, if you're going to be controlled by somebody, Persia was a pretty good people to control you, because they would really basically just allow you to live life, farm, worship, do what you wanted to do. They had a temple. Remember, they had a temple. And actually, during this period of time, the Jews began to make their pilgrimages again. And that didn't happen in a long time, because there wasn't anything to go back to. And now they got a temple, and so they would travel for Passover, and they would travel to Pentecost. You remember Jesus? Remember Jesus and his mom and dad, and they traveled to the Passover? That wasn't going on for a long time, but it started again during this intertestament period. People traveling back to the temple to worship. And so they had it pretty good. As long as they paid their taxes, they had it pretty good. And then the Greeks came. So next slide. So we have the Greek-Persian Wars. All of you history buffs, you know about this stuff. The Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans, the Athenians. The Spartans called the Athenians girls, women. Another story, but all the Greek history, all that Greek history that you just love, this is where we are historically. Alexander the Great, 336. So it's 70 years-ish after Malachi. 70 years after Malachi, we got Alexander the Great. And in 10 years, he conquered Western Asia, Egypt, into Europe, and as far south as India. And then Alexander the Great came to the Promised Land, 329 BC. Now I'm going to show you some stuff, and it comes from Josephus. Y'all know who Josephus is? I didn't say Bocephus. I said Josephus. He was a Jewish historian that lived in the time of Jesus. And we can whatever, some Jews call him a traitor, and he did side with the Romans until the very end, and we can just all that. But he wrote a history of the Jewish people, and it's one of the few things that we have. And this is what he said about Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. So I got to read, because I don't remember all this. When Alexander the Great, and this is a summary of some things Josephus wrote. When Alexander the Great was on the attack in Palestine, and he was fighting against the city of Tyre, that's real far north, he told the high priest Jadus in Jerusalem to send him men to fight with him. The high priest refused because he had given his word not to fight against the Persian king. Who did Israel belong to, per se, at that time? The Persians. And the Persians had been good to them. And so the high priest, who was kind of the ruler of Jerusalem, we're just talking about Jerusalem, not the whole land, just Jerusalem, that he was kind of like the mayor of town, but even more than that. He was the ruler of Jerusalem. And he said, I've given my word to Darius the king not to fight against the Persians. And Alexander said, well, okay, when I get done here, I'm going to come and I'm going to wipe Jerusalem off the map. And that's where we stand. No, now, Alexander the Great goes all the way down the Mediterranean coast, and he gets it all. He defeats everything on the western coast of the Mediterranean, of the nation of Israel. He's got it all. And then he turns his sights to Jerusalem. The high priest, in hearing that he's coming, he put out all the fairs and fineries in hopes to convince Alexander to take mercy on the Jews and Jerusalem. They could only hope. The high priest and the inhabitants of Jerusalem went out to meet Alexander. And there's this big long story about him riding on the white tall horse, and he was kind of a tall guy too, and he looked like a god. Josephus said that. And so the high priest and the inhabitants went out to meet Alexander, and the unexpected happened. When Alexander saw the high priest Jaddus dressed in his high priestly robes and in his turban adorned with a golden plate engraved with the Hebrew name of God across it, and this is quoting English translation of Josephus, he approached by himself and adorned that name. What name? The name of God. And first saluted, actually bowed before the high priest. Now, he had just said, I'm fixing to wipe Jerusalem off the map. That was the last thing he said, and that everybody thought that's what he was coming to do. In explanation, Alexander said that he had seen a high priest in a dream before he embarked on his campaign of conquest. In his dream, the high priest had assured Alexander that he would be victorious over the Persians. The high priest took the scroll of Daniel. This is in Josephus. Alexander was next taken into Jerusalem, where he offered a sacrifice to God at the temple, according to the high priest's direction. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared, chapter 11, that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. And you'll see the quotation marks. That is directly from Josephus. And historical fact. People can doubt what Josephus said all they want to and said that's fairy tale and that's made up stuff. Okay, but this is fact. When Alexander was ruling the Greeks, he gave the Jews the rights to worship however they wanted to worship and exempted them from taxes every 7th year. Now, what's the 7th year? The sabbatical year. Why did they go off into captivity? Because they didn't do it. And so they learned their lesson, and they said, we will observe the sabbatical year. And I'm assuming that they explained that to Alexander, and they said on the 7th year, we have no ability to pay any kind of taxes to you. And Alexander says, okay. All right, don't worry about it. Now here's the bad news. Alexander died when he was 30. It lasted for a short period of time. Next slide. So this is the Alexander the Great, 323. This is the year that he died. This is the kingdom. Israel being in there. Next slide. So, because in the early days, the Greeks acted favorably toward the Jews, many of the Jews accepted Greek culture. And that's why we have Hellenists in the Bible. You remember when the Hellenists came and they wanted to talk to Jesus, and Philip, because he had a Greek name, they went to him first. And they said, we'd like to talk to Jesus. And then another time, the Hellenists and the Pharisees joined together, and they hated one another. And they came to Jesus, and they asked him about paying taxes. Y'all remember that? Who were the Hellenists? Well, their mom was Helen. No. Helen, Hellas, that's the Greek name for Greece. My daughter, Maddie, probably can't wear it anymore, actually has a shirt from Greece, Greek flag, and then right across the top in Greek letters is Hellas. And that's Greek. They were Greeks culturally. What makes a Greek? You speak the Greek language. It's like being an American, really. The Greeks cared very little for your ethnicity, and all they wanted you to do was be Greek culturally and in lifestyle, speak the Greek language. And so this was the beginnings of the Hellenistic age of the world. The Bible was written in what language? New Testament? English, it was good for Paul, is good for me. Not English. The New Testament was written in Greek. And there's a reason for that. More people spoke Greek than any other way. First translation of the Old Testament. Septuagint. Greek. And we think, especially the Hebrew writer, the writer of Hebrews, a lot of the quotations, Jesus quoting, and the Hebrew writer quoting, it sounds a whole lot like the Septuagint than it does the Hebrew Old Testament. So they actually quoted a lot out of the Septuagint. And that happened in Alexandria, Egypt, which was very much, obviously, Alexander the Great. Alexander, am I right? Did he die in Alexandria? Mike tells me yes, he died in Alexandria. That city was named after Alexander the Great. So this is all in Daniel's prophecy in chapter 11. So Alexander dies, Greek Empire falls apart, into civil war, eventually divided among Alexander's generals. Next slide. And there it is. So I want you to pay really close attention. I'm looking at my clock. Seleucids and Ptolemies. The PT, Ptolemy. Ptolemies, Africa. Seleucids, East. Just think of it that way. Some of these other guys kind of fall apart. Next slide. This is kind of what it looks like. And this is Daniel's vision in chapter 11, King of the North, King of the South. If you can kind of see, I probably should move Israel a little bit, but do you see where the pink and the green come together? Yeah, where's that at? That's in Israel. This is the battle that's going on in Daniel chapter 11. And you say, how'd Daniel know all about that? God. God told him all that. So God is the one telling him. And this hadn't happened, but Daniel's telling us how it happens. King of the North, King of the South. Next slide. So from about 300 to 200 BC, the Ptolemies rule. And they are the lenient ones. They were the ones that allowed them to worship. They exempted them from taxes. They had it pretty good. Israel had it pretty good for 100 years or so, 150 years or so. And then the Seleucids came. So the Seleucids take ownership of Israel in 200. And this is where life gets hard. And this is eventually results in 167 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes. You've probably heard that name before. And he was the guy that came in. He overthrew the rightful heir of the priesthood. He kicked the Jew out. He put a priest of Zeus in the temple. He put a statue of Zeus in the temple. He did all kinds of ugly things, pig's blood and all that. He just decimated the temple. And it got awful. It got awful for the Jewish people. Many of the Jewish people fled. And this is described in the book of Daniel of this evil character, Antiochus Epiphanes, who becomes kind of an archetype for the Antichrist. He's that archetype character for the Antichrist in the book of Daniel. And then we have the Maccabees. So the revolt of the Maccabees, 167 and 134 BC, the Jewish resistance of the Seleucids. Next slide. And in 164 BC, they got control of the temple and in that vicinity, and they restored worship in Jerusalem. Happy Hanukkah, y'all. This is Hanukkah. This is what Hanukkah is all about. Why is it a festival of lights? Because there is and it's in the Talmud, it's in Josephus, that they got into the temple and they found one flask of pure olive oil. If you go back and you read Exodus, there was a certain kind of oil that you used in the menorah, the lampstand, the 7-branch lampstand, and they had one flask and they filled it up and it burned for 8 days, which they say is a miracle. And this is the 8-day festival, which starts around our Christmas and goes into January. And this is the Festival of Lights. Happy Hanukkah. This is why they celebrate what they do during this time. And so the Jews eventually gain control. Now, it takes a little while. They're still fighting with the Seleucids, but you'll see down there 140 to 37, approximately the Hasmonean dynasty. This is approximately the time period where the Jews, for about 100 years, have independence, self-governance. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And they actually gain control of almost as much land, the Hasmonean kings, for that 100-year period, from about 160, 140, down to about, well, when the Romans came, 63. For about that 100-year period, they actually gained control of almost all of what Solomon ruled. And this is why, when we open the New Testament, that we have Jews all over the Promised Land. You know, Peter and John lived up around Galilee. And but then you had all the Judean Jews who were down around Jerusalem. Why is all that? Because, next slide, this is what the Hasmonean people, the Jewish Israeli people, they occupied that. Now, it's actually 2 slides because I couldn't decide which one I liked. I kind of like the little key down at the bottom on that one. And actually, you see those little white boxes which you can't read? Well, that key right there is kind of telling you what those white boxes are saying. It's basically telling you kings and when they ruled, and I'm talking about Hasmonean Jewish kings. And there's all kinds of arguments out there of whether they were legitimately descendants of David, and I won't get into all that. But all I will say is factually, the Jews for about a 100-year period ruled Israel again, which is pretty remarkable. Next slide. And then the Romans came. And it was bad. It was really bad. Josephus describes this. There were some holdouts at the end of those Roman Jewish wars, at the end of the BC dates. He talked about people eating dead bodies, and yeah, it was bad. So the Romans defeat Israel, and hence we have the New Testament. When we open up Matthew, who's ruling? The Romans are. And that's where it stands. Now, the Romans had a way of ruling where they would actually take what I called grassroots leaders. So they kind of were already in leadership. And so they would just call them over to Rome and they'd say, hey, look here. We'll let you rule as long as you make sure that you collect all the taxes and you get the tax money to Rome. And that's how the Herods grew up, came to power. And the Herods were Jewish-ish. But they had Jewish blood in them. Next slide. And so this is how the land looked when the Romans were ruling in the time of Jesus. Luke chapter 3 talks about a lot of these guys. So you got Herod and his rulership in gray. You've got, what's his name? Archelaus, his rulership in that white color. Then you got Philip. And you remember that Herod and Philip were brothers, and Herod married his brother's wife, and John the Baptist said you ought not to do that, and Herod cut his head off. So that's what all these different rulerships. And that's all I got to say about that. And that's where we are at this point. Comments or questions? I know that was a whole lot of a history lesson, but some of that's who owned the land. And I'll have to admit, and I hope you don't get too bored with this, but it's going to be like that for a little bit, because we're going to fly through the New Testament, because the land is still occupied by the Romans. And we'll talk about a little bit of things that goes on there in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple and all that kind of stuff. And then we have to fly through from 70 AD to 2024. I mean, 2,000 years of history, and who owns what, and what's going on with the land then, and do what you...
48?
Yeah, 1948, yeah. All right. Announcements. It is daylight savings time this weekend, and so just go ahead and spring forward. Y'all, everybody right now, go. Just get used to it. All right, just don't forget. Go be here on Sunday school, 9:45, 10:45, and then I'll tell you what, I'll give you an extra hour of sunlight that evening. How about that? Good trade, in my opinion. All right, and then Harper Owen, March 12th, Tuesday, March 12th, week from yesterday. He's going to have his Eagle Scout honors here at the church, 6:30. You're all invited. Spanish class, Sunday, 4 to 5 o'clock. And adult game day, not this Thursday, but the next. There will be a new ladies' Bible study that will start on March the 26th, going through May the 7th. 10 a.m. in the morning on Tuesdays, 10 a.m., 6 p.m. I'm reading. It's going to be on the book of Nehemiah, A Heart That Can Break by Kelly Mentor. If you got any questions on that, see Miss Carolyn. She's not here tonight, but we'll have all this in the bulletin on Sunday so that if you need that. And then another thing, this is just really weird, y'all. Easter's in March this year. That just don't seem right. Has that happened before? I'm sure it has. I just forgot. What does that happen, about every 7 years or 4 years? Okay, so March 31st, Easter. And we will have sunrise service that morning, so just be looking for announcements on that. Any other announcements? Yes?
There's pizza, and there's pizza back there, and then there's sign-up sheets for the meal for next Wednesday. If you want to do soup, put your name on there and what soup you want. And if you want to do a dessert, you can put your name and a dessert.
Okay, help out with that. Any others?
Thank you for announcing Harper's ceremony next Tuesday. We just wanted to add that there will be cake and ice cream afterwards, so please come prepared to eat that. Ceremony will be about an hour, maybe a little less, and then we'll have some refreshments afterward. And if you don't make it, we're getting a full sheet cake, so you can enjoy it Wednesday night at the meal, because we're leaving the rest here for that.
I'll be at both, okay? Can I do that? All right, thank you. Well, that we'll enjoy that. Celebrate Harper. Okay, other announcements. All right, then it's time for me to say goodnight to our online audience. Have anything, prayer requests, or even announcements that you want us to announce, please let us know. And want to say goodbye to them. Prayer request here